They said it would never survive a real battle. No turret, no chance. What happened next shocked NATO. In 1956, Swedish engineer Sven Burge presented the military leadership with a design for a tank without a turret. Everyone thought he had lost his mind. Generals laughed, experts shook their heads, and foreign specialists called it a technical absurdity. A tank without a turret? That's just self-propelled artillery, not a real main battle tank. But 10 years later, this crazy machine was in service with the Swedish Army. 20 years later, British and American tank crews were testing it and calling it revolutionary. How did one man manage to convince an entire country to build a tank that contradicted nearly every rule of tank design? And why did this strange vehicle serve for 30 years when everyone predicted its failure? The Cold War was escalating, and small neutral Sweden found itself in a very uncomfortable position. To the east loomed the Soviet Union with its thousands of tanks, while Sweden's own armored fleet looked discouraging. The army operated British Centurions, enormous 3-meter giants weighing 50 tons and barely reaching 35 kilometers per hour. These clumsy monsters were poorly suited for defending Sweden's forests and lakes. The country needed its own tank, specifically adapted to Swedish terrain. In the early 1950s, the Ministry of Defense launched a program to develop a new heavy tank under the codename KRV. The requirements were ambitious: about 30 tons in weight, powerful armament, strong protection, and high mobility. A consortium of Landsverk, Volvo, and Bofors proposed a design featuring a massive 155mm gun mounted in an oscillating turret. On paper, the project looked impressive. But it had one major problem: cost. The KRV program required enormous investments that small Sweden simply could not afford. In 1953, when Britain unexpectedly agreed to sell Centurions directly, work on KRV was officially frozen. Unofficially, discussions continued. The military understood that the Centurion was only a temporary solution, not a long-term answer to Sweden's defense needs. It was at this moment that Sven Burge stepped onto the stage. The 40-year-old engineer worked at the Royal Swedish Army Ordnance Administration, inspecting tank production. But Burge was not just a bureaucrat, he was a reserve tank officer. He had personally driven tanks and understood their problems from the inside. Most importantly, he spoke not only Swedish and English, but also French, German, and Russian. This allowed him to study specialized armored warfare literature from around the world, reading original technical reports and military research. In the summer of 1956, Burge completed an analysis of tank losses in World War II and the Korean War. The statistics were shocking. The risk of being hit directly correlated with vehicle height. More than half of all tank losses resulted from turret penetrations. Burge reached a radical conclusion: any new tank must be as low as possible. And the simplest way to make a tank low? Remove the turret entirely. On October 22, 1956, Burge filed a patent application describing a method of aiming the gun using the tank's own tracks. The idea sounded insane. Instead of a rotating turret, the entire tank would turn for horizontal aiming, while vertical aiming would be achieved through a special suspension system capable of raising and lowering the hull. When Burge presented his concept to his superiors, the reaction was cautious and cold. A turretless tank sounded like a step backward to the assault guns and tank destroyers of the 1930s. But Burge was extraordinarily persuasive. He wasn't just proposing the removal of the turret, he was introducing an entirely new philosophy of tank design based on real combat loss data. He studied the success of World War II tank destroyers like the Stug and Jagdpanzer, which proved highly effective in defense thanks to their low silhouettes. He also analyzed the French Char B1, whose precise transmission allowed hull-mounted weapon aiming. Burge wanted to combine these advantages: low profile, excellent controllability, and accurate targeting, in one machine. But this required a fully automated transmission and a revolutionary suspension system. Despite skepticism, Burge received permission to continue development. Military leadership understood that if the concept worked, Sweden could field a tank far cheaper than traditional designs while maintaining comparable combat effectiveness. Given limited budgets, that was very appealing. By 1957, the KRV program had completely collapsed due to armament problems, and the military began searching for alternatives. 3 development paths emerged. Stridsvagn A followed British-American tank design principles, A42. 5-ton vehicle with respectable power. Stridsvagn T reflected the Franco-German school, a lighter 32-ton tank with thinner armor but excellent mobility. And Stridsvagn S, Burge's concept, where S stood for Sverige, Sweden. All three were to be armed with a 105mm gun, but only the S eliminated the turret. To test feasibility, Burge asked Bofors to build a prototype suspension and transmission system. Engineers installed an experimental hydropneumatic suspension on decommissioned American Sherman tanks and Swedish IKV-103 assault guns. The results exceeded expectations. The system worked. The suspension could precisely raise and lower the hull, enabling vertical gun aiming. In 1958, the Swedish parliament debated which alternative to choose. The discussion was heated. Supporters of the A variant emphasized proven design and reliability. Advocates of the T variant highlighted superior mobility. Burge argued that only his turretless tank could combine low cost, strong protection, and adequate firepower for Swedish conditions. The decision was surprising. Parliament chose the S, even though it was the most expensive option. Why? Because it had symbolic value. Neutral Sweden wanted to demonstrate its industrial competence by creating a fundamentally new type of tank that no one else had. Bofors received a contract to build 2 prototypes, S1 and S2. Landsverk developed the transmission, and Volvo supplied the engines. The S2 prototype received a unique hybrid power plant combining a diesel engine and a gas turbine, an absolutely innovative solution. No one had ever installed a turbine in a production tank before. In 1960, the Army ordered 10 pre-series vehicles. They arrived for testing in 1963. Tank crews immediately encountered a practical issue. 2 crew members could drive and fire the tank, but maintenance duties and reloading required more manpower. The solution was unusual. A 3rd crew member was added, seated facing backward. This radio operator driver was positioned at the rear of the tank with full driving controls. This allowed the tank to retreat at maximum speed while always keeping its thick frontal armor toward the enemy. In 1963, the tank was unveiled publicly and caused a global sensation. Even U.S. President John F. Kennedy showed interest. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara noted its advantages over the American M60, lower silhouette, lighter weight, and amphibious capability. The tank was designated Stridsvagn 103. It stood only 2.14 meters tall compared to 3 meters for the Swedish Centurions. The suspension could lower the hull even further. Behind a ridge, the tank nearly disappeared. Its 105mm Royal Ordnance L7 gun ran through the entire hull, with spent casings automatically ejected from the rear. The autoloader fired once every 3 seconds, 15 rounds per minute, faster than most manually loaded tanks. The frontal armor plate was only 40mm thick, but sloped at 78 degrees from vertical. The effective thickness increased dramatically due to the angle. Stridsvagn 103 became the world's first production tank equipped with a gas turbine engine. The Soviet T-80 and American Abrams would appear many years later. By the early 1970s, 290 tanks had been built. Foreign trials were impressive. In Norway, the S-tank detected more targets and fired faster than the Leopard 1. British trials concluded that the turretless concept had significant advantages. American tests at Fort Knox found it more accurate than the M60. Critics claimed it was only suitable for defense. But Swedish doctrine was aggressive. Units equipped with the Stridsvagn 103 were designated assault brigades. Their mission was counterattacks against invading forces. All 3 crew members could drive and fire the tank. Even after losing 2 crew members, it could remain operational, a unique feature. In the 1980s, modernization to the C version added a new diesel engine, laser rangefinder, and improved fire control systems. A secret addition, revealed only in 1992, was a special slat armor mounted on the front to prematurely detonate shaped charge warheads. Fuel cans along the sides also served as additional spaced protection. However, new Soviet 125mm armor-piercing rounds could penetrate its frontal armor. Plans for a replacement, Stridsvagn 2000, were eventually cancelled after the Cold War ended. Defense budgets were cut. In 1991, Sweden decided to purchase foreign tanks. After competitive trials between the M1A2 Abrams, Leopard 2, and French Leclerc, the Leopard 2 won. Before retirement, One final exercise was held in the late 1990s. 7 Stridsvagn 103 tanks in defensive positions faced 7 modern Leopard 2A4s. The result was astonishing. The 30-year-old turretless tanks destroyed all 7 Leopards while losing only one vehicle. Their low silhouette, rapid rate of fire, and ability to reverse quickly from firing positions proved decisive in defensive combat. Yet 1997 marked the end. The tank was retired not because it performed poorly, it had never seen real combat, but because modern warfare required advanced thermal imaging, digital fire control systems, and accurate fire on the move. The Stridsvagn 103 had become technologically outdated. 30 years of service is impressive for any tank. For such an unconventional design, it is extraordinary. The story of the Stridsvagn 103 is unique. Engineer Sven Burge proposed a seemingly insane idea, a turretless tank, and convinced an entire nation to build 290 of them. Everyone predicted failure. Instead, it served for 3 decades and even defeated its successor in a final exercise. The secret lay in Sweden's defensive reality. Forests, hills, lakes, terrain where low profile, rapid fire, and quick withdrawal mattered more than turret rotation. The tank that many considered a dead end in evolution actually anticipated future trends. Autoloaders, reduced crews, hybrid propulsion, advanced suspension systems. Today, several Stridsvagn 103 tanks remain operational in Sweden's Arsenal and Tank Museum, including the only prototype of the D version. They stand as reminders of a time when a small neutral nation challenged the conventions of tank design and succeeded. Sven Burge proved that sometimes the craziest ideas turn out to be the most enduring. But the legacy of the Stridsvagn 103 goes far beyond Sweden's borders and far beyond the Cold War. For decades, military engineers around the world quietly studied the S-tank. Officially, most nations dismissed the turretless concept as too specialized, too unconventional, too dependent on defensive doctrine. Unofficially, they were fascinated, because the S-tank forced a dangerous question. What if the turret, the defining feature of a tank for nearly half a century, was no longer essential? In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, tank design began to change in subtle ways. Turrets became smaller, crews were reduced, autoloaders became common outside the Soviet Union. Remote weapon stations replaced exposed machine guns. Some experimental vehicles even moved crews into protected hull capsules, separating them from the gun system entirely. In other words, the philosophy that Burge introduced in 1956, protect the crew, lower the silhouette, automate everything possible, slowly became mainstream. Modern Russian tanks like the T-14 Armata use an unmanned turret. Many Western next-generation concepts propose fully automated gun systems. Active suspension systems, once revolutionary on the S-tank, are now standard in advanced armored vehicles. Hybrid propulsion, once considered exotic, is being researched again for future combat platforms. The Stridsvagn 103 did not create these trends alone, but it proved they were possible. And perhaps more importantly, it proved that innovation does not always come from superpowers. Sweden was not a military giant. It did not possess the industrial scale of the United States or the Soviet Union. It could not afford endless experimentation. Every decision had to be precise, calculated, and efficient. That pressure created clarity. Instead of building the biggest tank, Sweden built the smartest one for its environment. The S-tank was not designed to charge across the plains of Germany. It was designed to wait silently behind granite ridges, between pine forests, along frozen lakes. It was built for ambush, for controlled aggression, for counterattack. In those conditions, it was devastating. Crews trained relentlessly in coordination. Because the gun was fixed, the driver and gunner had to operate almost as one mind. Steering corrections were firing corrections. Movement was aiming. It required discipline, but once mastered, it allowed extraordinary precision. Veterans who served on the Stridsvagn 103 often described it not as a tank, but as a precision instrument. There were psychological advantages as well. Opponents accustomed to tall turreted tanks instinctively searched for familiar silhouettes. The S-tank offered none. From a distance, it resembled terrain more than machinery. In winter camouflage, half buried in snow, it became almost invisible. And yet, despite its strengths, Sweden never attempted to export it widely. Why? Because the S-tank was honest. It did not pretend to be universal. It was not built for deserts, nor urban warfare, nor expeditionary operations overseas. It was built for Sweden, and Sweden alone. That level of specialization is rare in military procurement, where political compromise often produces multi-role vehicles that do many things adequately but nothing perfectly. The Stridsvagn 103 was different. It embraced its role completely. When it finally retired in 1997, there was no dramatic battlefield farewell. No final combat mission, no last stand. Instead, it quietly rolled into storage, its engines still functional. Its systems still precise, replaced not because it failed, but because technology had moved forward. Thermal imaging, digital battle management systems, stabilized fire on the move. These were not weaknesses of the concept, they were limitations of the era in which it was born. Had Sven Burge been designing in the 1990s instead of the 1950s, perhaps the story would have evolved differently. Perhaps the S-tank would have received a fully digital fire control suite. Perhaps an unmanned remote weapon module. Perhaps a more powerful gun integrated into a compact armored hull. Perhaps the world would have seen a second generation of turretless main battle tanks. But history chose another path. Today, visitors to the Arsenal and Tank Museum can see the Stridsvagn 103 up close. It still looks futuristic. Its wedge-shaped hull still seems unconventional even among modern vehicles. Children stare at it and ask the same question people asked in 1956. Where is the turret? And that question is the key to its legend. The Stridsvagn 103 reminds us that progress does not always follow a straight line. Sometimes innovation looks like madness. Sometimes the boldest ideas are rejected first. And sometimes a small country, working quietly and methodically, can challenge global assumptions. Sven Burge was not trying to shock the world. He was trying to solve a problem. He looked at battlefield statistics instead of tradition. He trusted data instead of dogma. He asked what truly mattered: crew survival, first shot accuracy, defensive advantage, and built a machine around those priorities. For 30 years, that machine stood ready in Sweden's forests, prepared for a war that never came. And maybe that is its greatest victory. Because the ultimate purpose of a defensive weapon is not to fight, but to deter. The Stridsvagn 103 did exactly that. A tank without a turret. A design without precedent. An idea that refused to die. And proof that sometimes, the future belongs to those brave enough to question the obvious. There is one more dimension to this story that is often overlooked, the human one. Because behind every radical machine stands not just an engineer, but a generation willing to trust him. Inside the Swedish army, acceptance of the Stridsvagn 103 did not happen overnight. Younger officers were intrigued. They saw potential in automation and low-profile tactics. But many senior commanders had grown up with turreted tanks. To them, a tank that had to turn its entire hull to aim felt wrong, almost vulnerable. Training became the turning point. When crews began spending hundreds of hours inside the S-tank, skepticism slowly transformed into confidence. The vehicle demanded a different mindset. Traditional tanks separate roles clearly: the driver drives, the gunner shoots, the commander commands. In the Stridsvagn 103, responsibilities overlapped. All three crew members could operate the main gun and drive the vehicle. This created something unusual: redundancy. If the commander was incapacitated, the tank could still fight. If the driver was wounded, the rear driver could take over instantly. In an era when crew survivability often depended on a single critical specialist, that flexibility was revolutionary. And then there was the doctrine. Sweden's defense strategy during the Cold War was based on total national resistance. Every road, every bridge, every forest clearing had pre-planned defensive positions. The S-tank fit perfectly into this system. It could dig in using its front dozer blade, lower its suspension, and transform into what was essentially a steel bunker with a 105mm gun. In prepared positions, it was extraordinarily difficult to detect, and even harder to hit effectively. Military simulations throughout the 1970s repeatedly showed that in defensive engagements, the S-tank achieved first-shot advantage more often than conventional designs. And in tank warfare, the first accurate shot is often decisive. However, no machine is perfect. In open maneuver warfare across flat terrain, turreted tanks retained greater flexibility. The need to align the hull for horizontal aiming required precise coordination and space to maneuver. The S-tank excelled in ambush and counterattack, but it was less comfortable in fluid, high-speed armored breakthroughs. Yet this was not a flaw. It was a reflection of design philosophy. Sweden never intended to fight distant expeditionary wars. Its tanks were not meant to deploy across continents. They were guardians of a specific geography. And geography shapes machines. By the late 1980s, as technology advanced rapidly, Swedish engineers began asking a new question: what if the turretless concept could evolve further? Studies explored improved stabilization systems that would allow limited accurate fire on the move. More powerful guns were considered. Advanced composite armor packages were evaluated. Some proposals even suggested semi-independent gun mounts within a compact armored superstructure, preserving the low silhouette while increasing engagement flexibility. But then geopolitics intervened. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the massive armored threat that had justified Sweden's unique approach suddenly evaporated. Defense budgets shrank. Strategic priorities shifted toward international cooperation and interoperability with European partners. The era that had created the Stridsvagn 103 was over. And yet, its philosophical influence lingered. Today, modern armored vehicle designers face new threats: top attack missiles, precision-guided munitions, drone surveillance, and loitering munitions that hunt from above. The battlefield is more transparent than ever before. In such an environment, silhouette once again matters. Crew protection once again dominates design discussions. Automation is no longer optional, it is essential. Unmanned systems are becoming the future of armored warfare. Remote turrets, crew capsules. If you enjoyed this story about the strange Swedish tank, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Write in the comments which unusual military vehicles you'd like to learn about next. See you in the next episode.